I never imagined I would ever utter these words aloud. But now that I sit here, the same overwhelming feeling engulfs me. Like an icy wave I can't escape. How did I allow something like this to happen? How did it go this far? The truth is, I'm ashamed to even discuss it. Yet it feels like the only way to free myself from the torment that's been haunting me. Before we go any further, please subscribe to my channel for more fascinating true confessions like this one. Be sure to watch until the end and hit the like button to show your support. It's strange how the mind can convince you that you're doing the right thing, even when deep down you know it's wrong. This was never meant to be how things turned out. What started as a fleeting moment of weakness spiraled into something uncontrollable. And now I'm left with the guilt, the confusion, and the unbearable reality. I tried to forget it, tried to bury it deep inside where it couldn't hurt me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the truth of what happened. Sitting here now, I see just how much damage has been done. How could I ever explain this to anyone? How do you confess that you crossed an unforgivable line? A line that should never have been crossed in the first place? I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, but maybe telling you this, confessing, will be the first step in confronting what I've done. Looking back, I almost convinced myself that everything seemed perfectly fine in the beginning. It was one of those nights where the world felt calm. The type of evening where the simple routines of life seemed comforting. My mom had just finished cooking dinner, and the three of us, my mom, Greg, and I, sat at the table. There was laughter, light conversation, and the clinking of silverware on porcelain. For a brief moment, it felt like we were just another ordinary family. But if I'm honest with myself, I know that wasn't the truth. I could feel it even then. The shift in the air between Greg and me. At first, it was subtle, easy to dismiss as a passing thought or just a flicker of attention. But it was undeniable in its quiet persistence. I would catch myself glancing at him, watching the way he laughed at my mom's jokes, how his eyes seemed to sparkle in the soft dining room light. I tried not to stare too long, tried to ignore the strange sensation creeping up my spine, but it wasn't easy. I wasn't sure what to make of this unease that had started to settle in me. I didn't want to admit that something was changing inside me, that the easy comfort of our family dinners was beginning to feel different. What was it? A shift I couldn't explain. Was it just me? Or was something shifting between us? Something that, for reasons I couldn't yet understand, I wasn't ready to confront. The moment my mom left, I felt it. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew things had changed. She was leaving for another one of her business trips, the kind she'd taken countless times before. But this time felt different. It was as though she wasn't just leaving the house. She was leaving behind the fragile balance of our family. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her pull out of the driveway. The house was quieter now, emptier, in a way I hadn't fully realized until the silence settled over me. And then it was just Greg and me. The space between us felt strange at first. There was nothing to it. Just the usual small talk that happens when two people are alone but unsure of what to say. I had expected to feel relief, to enjoy the quiet. But instead, it felt like the air had thickened, and suddenly, every word we spoke seemed loaded with something unspoken. We talked about little things, dinner plans, how our days went, but there was a subtle shift in the way we spoke to each other. The distance that had always existed between us was starting to close. I noticed how his hand brushed mine when we reached for the same mug. how his gaze lingered a moment too long when we made eye contact. It felt intimate, but in a way that made my heart race. I tried to ignore it, told myself it meant nothing, but deep down I knew something was changing. Something that hadn't been there before. And now, with my mom gone, it was just the two of us. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when it all started. At first, everything seemed so innocent. Just simple moments I could brush aside. But now, looking back, I realized those moments were not as insignificant as I once thought. I couldn't escape how they lingered in my mind, replaying over and over, as if I couldn't quite understand them. It all began one afternoon when Greg walked into the kitchen, as casually as he always did. I didn't expect anything unusual, but then he did something that stopped me cold. He wasn't wearing a shirt. Time seemed to slow, as my eyes involuntarily traced the muscles on his back, the way the light caught his skin. I wasn't prepared for it, and it rattled me more than I cared to admit. The moment stretched into an uncomfortable silence I couldn't escape. He didn't seem to notice my hesitation, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. I should have looked away, should have said something, but I didn't. I just stood there frozen, feeling the heat rise in my chest as my breath caught a little longer than it should have. It felt as though I had crossed a line without even realizing it. I told myself it meant nothing. After all, it was just Greg, my mom's boyfriend, someone I had known for years. But that's the thing, isn't it? It wasn't nothing. Later that evening, as I stirred dinner, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. The house seemed smaller, as if the walls were closing in. I wore a light, sheer outfit, something I wouldn't have thought twice about before. But tonight, it felt different. When Greg entered the kitchen, his gaze met mine, and the brief look was enough to stop my heart. There was a shift in the air, a tension neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. It was as if everything we had kept hidden was suddenly exposed, even without saying a word. The silence between us, the unspoken things we couldn't bring ourselves to say, hung in the room, suffocating me. I wanted to break the silence, wanted to speak, but I was terrified of what would happen if I did. What was happening to us? Why couldn't I just let go of this feeling? It wasn't supposed to happen. I had no reason to be that close to him. It was just another ordinary day. Nothing special. When I bumped into Greg in the parking lot, it wasn't a hard collision, but it was enough to make me stumble back a few steps. In the process, I dropped my keys and they skittered across the pavement, landing a few feet away. I cursed softly under my breath and bent to pick them up. And then it happened. As I reached for the keys, Greg bent down at the same time, and our hands brushed. The contact was brief, but in that moment, something shifted. I felt it. This electric spark that traveled through my fingers, up my arm. I looked up involuntarily, and our eyes met for a brief second. Time seemed to stop, and the air became charged with something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just a casual brush of hands. It felt like something deeper, an unspoken connection neither of us dared acknowledge. His gaze held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and I could sense something there. A flicker of something I didn't understand, but felt deeply. We both quickly pulled our hands back, as if the touch had been too much. The silence that followed felt heavy, but I tried to force a smile, pretending it didn't matter. But inside, my heart was racing. Why did that brief touch feel like the air had been charged with electricity? I couldn't help but wonder if Greg felt it too. It was one of those cold nights when the air seemed to cling to your skin, biting at your thoughts. The power unexpectedly went out, and the house was swallowed by an eerie silence. I didn't expect the power failure to be anything more than an inconvenience. But the stillness felt different, somehow. Greg and I were in the living room, suddenly wrapped in the quiet of the darkened house. It felt oddly intimate, the absence of usual noise making everything else stand out. Our breathing, the rustle of fabric. We both reached for the same blanket at the same time. A small laugh escaping my lips as I tried to pull it from the couch. "Guess we're sharing this," he said, his voice low but warm. I nodded, unable to trust my own voice. There was no reason to be nervous. It was just a blanket, just us sitting in the cold. But when he sat next to me and pulled the blanket over us, the air between us thickened, and I couldn't ignore it. We were close, not out of necessity, but because there was nowhere else to go. The flickering candlelight illuminated his face, making him seem closer, more real, as if the shadows could no longer hide anything. For the first time in a while, I didn't look away. His eyes met mine, and the silence between us stretched long, filled with unspoken words. I didn't want to break it. I didn't want to ruin the fragile moment that seemed to hold so much weight. "What do you think about when you're alone like this?" Greg's voice broke the stillness, low and casual. But there was something more to it, an underlying depth that I couldn't quite place. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I should share my thoughts. But something about the vulnerability in the air, the way we sat so close, made me feel like maybe it was okay to open up, just a little. "I think about things I never tell anyone," I said softly. "Things that are too complicated. I think about the future, what it holds, what could be." I hadn't meant to say so much, but once the words were out, I couldn't take them back. Greg was quiet for a moment before shifting slightly, his shoulder brushing mine. "What if the future is different than we expect?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper, and it made the room feel smaller, as though it was just the two of us in the world. I looked at him again, and for the first time, I felt as though the space between us was narrowing. Not physically, but in a deeper, more intimate way. There were no more distractions, no more running from what I was feeling. The conversation, the shared silence, it felt like we were beginning to understand each other without needing to say anything else. In that moment, I realized how much I was allowing myself to feel. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. It was late, and the house had settled into an unnatural stillness. The kind that only comes when everyone else is asleep, and you're left alone with your thoughts. I had been in the kitchen for a while, mindlessly tidying up. My hands moved automatically, cleaning surfaces, but my mind was elsewhere. It was always like that when Greg was nearby. His presence seemed to pull me out of reality, making everything feel sharper, more vivid, and yet somehow more uncertain. I didn't hear him approach, but suddenly he was there, standing next to me. We didn't speak at first. The silence between us felt heavy, like it had weight, pressing down on me. I was painfully aware of every small movement, every breath that escaped my lips. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for me to speak, or if he, too, was unsure how to break the tension. We stood there for what seemed like forever, the space between us shrinking with each passing second. It was impossible to ignore how close we were, how aligned our bodies were. I could feel his presence more than I saw it. And somehow, that made it worse. My heart began to race, the sound of it pounding in my ears as I struggled to suppress the urge to step back, to distance myself from him. But I didn't. Then, without warning, he leaned in. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then his lips were on mine, warm, soft, and everything else seemed to disappear. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just the kiss. It was as if everything between us exploded in that one charged moment. It was a release, a pressure that had built up over days, weeks, months, and finally, it had nowhere to go but into this moment. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, we pulled back, neither of us saying a word. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't look at him, couldn't even think straight. My heart. I was breathing quickly, feeling short of breath. What had just happened? What had I just let happen? It felt like the end. I stood in front of the kitchen sink, and in what seemed like an instant, I heard his steps approaching. In a second, he pressed my chest into his strong arms. It felt amazing. I could feel him pressing against my back, and at that moment, I turned to face him. I gave him the most intense and passionate kiss I've ever shared. We continued kissing. It felt endless. The heat I felt was overwhelming as he gently led me to the bed. In the blink of an eye, he removed his clothes, revealing his hairy chest and toned abs. I did the same, exposing my body. And that's when I saw what my mother had been enjoying all along. His size was the largest I had ever seen. I opened my legs and he guided himself in. Holding his face, I felt him slide in deep, and it felt incredible. Could this be what pleasure really was? He didn't move, but I felt intense sensations all around my lower body. My toes felt numb, delicate, and I couldn't hold back a loud scream, though he paid no mind and only went deeper. I loved it. Afterward, I felt so weak, unable to walk, unsure of when I had fallen asleep. The next morning, I sat at my desk with the journal open in front of me. But I couldn't write a thing. My hands hovered above the pages, trembling slightly as my mind replayed everything from the night before. The weight of it wouldn't let go. The kiss, which had felt so natural, yet so wrong. There were moments, brief as they were, when I nearly convinced myself that it hadn't happened, that I hadn't allowed it to happen. But deep down, I knew the truth. And it gnawed at me, like a constant pain. The guilt was suffocating. I couldn't look at the page because I knew whatever I wrote would be stained by the shame clouding my thoughts. How had I let myself fall into something like this? It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything leading up to it. The lingering glances, the unspoken understanding. I hadn't intended for any of it to happen, but now it had, and I couldn't undo it. Just then, Greg entered the room, his steps heavy but deliberate. I looked up at him, my heart racing, but I couldn't speak. He stood there for a moment, almost as if gathering his thoughts, then softly said, "We need to talk." His words lingered in the air, thick with tension. He sat down beside me, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. It was as if we both acknowledged how huge what had happened was. Finally, he broke the silence, saying quietly, "I don't know what happened last night, but I know it can't happen again." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily in my chest. "I feel the same way," I whispered. "It shouldn't have happened. It was a mistake." We both sat there in silence, the words between us fragile, like a thin thread. Neither of us wanted to admit how much everything had changed, but we couldn't ignore it. "I don't want this to tear us apart," he said finally, his voice filled with emotion but firm. "We have to move on." for the sake of our family. I nodded again, more to myself than to him. You're right, I said, the words heavy as I spoke them. We can't let this ruin everything we've built. I don't want to lose it all. It wasn't an easy decision, and I knew the path ahead wouldn't be simple. But in that moment, I understood we had to put it behind us, bury it deep, and keep moving forward as if nothing had changed. For the family, for the life we had. And yet, even as I agreed to move on, part of me couldn't forget. A part of me knew something had shifted, and no matter how hard we tried to bury it, I wondered how long it would stay hidden. If you like this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt confessions. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Lily's journey. Drop your comments below and let's keep the conversation going.